Welcome to the AgEmerge podcast, brought to you by Ag Solutions Network. Your farming challenges are unique, so your practices should be too. We're here to share emerging ideas, build connections, and provoke conversation.
Get ready to improve your soil, your crops, your livestock, and your family's livelihood. I'm your producer, Kim Chase.
And I'm your host, Monte. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for joining us. Today, we welcome Danny Royer, Farm Coordinator at UC Merced. Danny has a great appreciation for the hands-on learning he's experienced in his life. And today, he and Monte will explore farming that looks at scaling back costs with sustainable practices, as well as inspiring the next generation through real-world experiences, just like he did while at Cal Poly. From smart farms to reimagining supply chains, we'll hear how Danny blends innovation with the art of growing food. Let's jump right in.
Welcome, everyone, to this episode of the AgEmerge podcast. Today, I'm joined by Danny Royer from California. Danny, welcome. How are you today?
I am amazing. It's a beautiful day, snow here where I'm at, so it's a beautiful California day for me.
Well, snow is a nice thing to get this time of year. That equates to some irrigation water in the summer, doesn't it?
You know, as farmers, we get to enjoy it in, both the recreational capacity, and then we get to, multi-benefit use of using it to grow some food later on.
Yeah, that's true. Well, Danny, I like to ask everybody to tell us their story, and you certainly, for those people that say they can't be involved in farming because they didn't come from a farm, you have certainly disproven that point. And I'd love for you to share your story and how you got started and involved in everything agriculture.
Yeah, so I do have a fun story where, no one in my family was really involved in agriculture. I have some great grandparents that came from the Netherlands that were in dairy, but that was multiple generations ago. So I got real fortunate that my best friend growing up had a farm, small family farm, and one year we decided to go to soccer camp at Cal Poly together, and that was in fourth grade, and that kind of started the path of I'm going to do everything I need to do to go to fourth grade. So 4-H, FFA through high school, and then Cal Poly I really attribute to everything that I've been able to do post school, and not just the education. Education there I learned how to learn, but they're learned by doing, attitude and their capacity to create opportunities for people like me who didn't have any farm experience to work on the farm. I worked for the ag operations and I worked for the dairy my entire career. I got to be there for 5 years at Cal Poly. So that really set the tone for when I graduated, coming back to Merced County, and working for, at the time, it was the largest family farming operation in the county. Between Merced, Fresno, and Madera counties, we were farming like 35,000 acres of irrigated land. And I got real involved in processing tomatoes and some R&D and equipment. So we had 2-row and 3-row tomato harvesters that were kind of the only ones around. Got real involved in subsurface drip irrigation early on in what the process of putting those systems in, and then the constraints of managing an irrigation district, and then having these new systems that require pretty specific flows. So got a bunch of experience out of school early on. That experience was I had some relationships that guided me there, and ended up leaving and going to work for someone who I think and I spent a year working with Benina Montes. At the time, it was Benina Burrows at Burrows Family Farms. And when I spent my year there, they had started with 300 acres of almonds and organic. And then the year I started, they decided to go with their whole ranch and go completely all in. And that was, I think, in 2013. So that's quite a while ago, before regenerative was really a word. So spent some time with the Burrows, and then went to kind of a completely different direction and went to work for the largest tomato processor in the world, the Morningstar Company. And that's where technology and I really came together, and I started really understanding how different types of data sets could really impact operations, and how those technologies could be applied at the field level. So it was a real fun 3 years with Morningstar. And then I went to Bowles Farming and was the vice president of technology there for a few years. and got to explore all of the kind of on-farm technologies. And Morningstar, it was more supply chain focused. Bowles was much more, how do we make irrigation automation work? What are the things we can do from variable rate in our soils, in our specialty crop setting, variable rate irrigation, looking at composting and how not only to look at compost from a farming standpoint, but in California we had some legislation that was creating real opportunity to get into the compost business. So Bowles was a great experience for me to get creative in how to uh, change things at the bottom line of a farm and operationally. So after that, I got to go do some consulting for a little bit. COVID put a damper on that, but it opened the door to this opportunity at UC Merced. I got to give a little background on the UC Merced. UC Merced's not even 20 years old as a campus, or I think we're turning 20 maybe this year. And so we're young. And when it was started, it was never supposed to be an ag school. But 20 years later, we're the only kind of University of California with a lot of open space available for build out. And quite a bit of that is actually irrigated land. So our chancellor dedicated 40 acres to build a farm. And so for the last 3 years, I've been really focused on building out what we call the experimental smart farm at UC Merced. And that's really a culmination of all of my industry experience over the last 15 years, and then combining that with some researchers who are doing research on the fringes of ag. But I see a lot of opportunity bringing them into, what does a farm look like? What does the technology on the farm open up for the types of research that they're doing? So, eclectic kind of background. I've bounced around a lot. Typical millennial. Don't spend anywhere more than, time more than 3 or 4 years anywhere. I'm on the long term plan here at UC Merced though now. I think they've got their hooks in me. I'm really enjoying the work I'm doing, and the potential impacts I'm going to have. So, long-winded introduction of myself.
Well, there's a lot to share, and I will say this: we're going to have a lot of fun talking today. We've got a lot of different directions we can go, and I'll do my best because you put us two squirrels together and try to figure out the path to get there. That'll be a challenge. So, I just was getting a kick out of how you went from the Burroughs family whiplash to was it directly to Morningstar from there? Did you say?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's some whiplash in cultural practices. Because today Burroughs is regenerative organic certified, but I will say this: a lot of research work was done when you were there at Morningstar. Different row widths, drip configurations, cover crop configurations, trying to solve the MOT and tomato challenge. And is there technology we can put on the harvesters for that? Um, I tell you what, walk us through on trying to implement new production practices in a large, vertically integrated farm such as Morningstar. So, well, a little background, and you fill in blanks if I mess this up here,
Mhm.
Danny. But Morningstar essentially rents a large portion of their tomato intake is farmland that they rent as part of a rotation of another farmer. They transplant. They make recommendations on what you do irrigation schedule wise and maybe cultivation and application wise, and then they harvest and take it to their plant. Another stream to their plant comes directly from farmers that have their own harvesters or harvester crews. But it's really vertically integrating those practices. So it's kind of unique take of what you're doing there. Talk about what it's like for food companies to integrate regenerative practices and what some of those challenges are for them.
So I think the Morningstar, you described it fairly well. The amount of ground that they're renting and farming themselves will fluctuate quite a bit based on the market, but most of their volume is coming from growers they're contracting with. But while they're doing that, they're able to maintain the control of planting and harvest, which gives you the capacity to control your flow into your factory, which is really where you can gain efficiencies and be more competitive. So the control of harvest and transplant was really critical. And as we, look at like how do you improve those, and I'll segue into how does that become regenerative and how do you implement something regenerative. What I found there, and that I've walked away with and kind of still carry is figuring out what you can measure and what's important to measure. Those are, and like how you can find those quickly are the really important. So we can measure a lot of things, but what can we measure well? And if that is the metric that we need, that's kind of where harmony is created. So when we could figure out something that we needed and how to measure it well and implement that across the enterprise, those were where the wins would happen. And usually the wins would come across because those metrics would have correlative value in some other stream of the supply chain somewhere. So, a real tangible example I can give is understanding that, for us operationally, this isn't necessarily related to the supply chain, but tons per hour for our harvest machines was really critical to our profitability. And there were different things that we learned how to measure and measure well that allows us to understand exactly what tons per acre we needed to be hitting from a productivity standpoint and how that correlated to actually bottom line profit. Never seen any other operation that could do that in real time, and do it as well as we were able to do. And not that it was not far from perfect, but we were able to figure out some very specific metrics, how to measure those well, and then how to take those metrics and correlate them to the other metrics that really matter to us, which was, financially, and then what we can do to tweak those. But in my consulting world, what I found, and I think that this is true for any type of implementation, is getting consensus on what those metrics are is really, really hard. And what ends up happening, and this is another unique to Morningstar, I think, is organizationally, that metric that matters comes top down. And that's what's unique about Morningstar is that the self-management component of it allowed us to collectively really, and there would be some really good conversations about what metrics mattered. But once you walked away from those conversations, like you had a consensus and everybody at the very least had good empathy and a good understanding of why we were doing this and why this is the direction we were going versus, a new CEO or a new management group saying this is what's really important. And I'm guilty of this is in my consulting of saying this is what you should be measuring. This is what matters. But usually I try to come to those looking at it from a bottom up view of like what really matters operationally. So to implement some of these new regenerative practices, I think that's one of the challenges is where's the motivation? Is it bottom up or is it top down? In a Burroughs example where that was, I mean, in its purest form, making the decision, even though we can wait 3 or 4 years before our first harvest to not fumigate and to really take some of those things in its purest form because it mattered to them. That's a very different approach than a food company trying to check a box, or a salesperson trying to check a box that, hey, this is regenerative and we need to make sure that we have these practices through our supply chain. So it's coming top down. So I think that, both from figuring out what to measure and then how to implement, the more bottom down it can be driven from, the more success you're probably going to find.
Yeah, because it boils down to a lot of times the problems with certifications or proof of practices is that we're doing the very bare minimum, you know, to meet those standards. Where, like when you're talking in the Burroughs family scenario, they started with, hey, what is the right thing to do? And because that's the right thing to do, that's what we want to do. Okay, so we're going to do this. Now, what is out there that exists that helps to tell that story or verify our practices so that we can capture some of the value of what our decision was, you know? And that's why they've kind of fallen into the regenerative organic certification to tell some of their practices. But there's several things they do that are far beyond what
Mm-hmm.
ROC is. Whereas, let's say if there's a international food company that wants to hit ROC, they're going to kind of just do, yeah, well, okay, what's the boxes? Okay, here's the 300 things we need to do. Check, we're done. We don't need to do 301. You know, 300 is what it is. So there is an intention gap there, isn't there?
Well, and my issue with that whole how all of that works right now is that it's created an entire other industry that self-justifies itself in auditing agencies. And every year there's a new version of that comes out with more rules and more boxes that need to be checked. And sometimes there's legit improvements to these things, but sometimes it's very clear to me that like we just needed to do something because that's like job security for us. So that's when you have that gap's going to get filled, and it gets filled by agencies that, and you know, and this is where technology to me can solve these problems. We can be transparent. We can tell everybody exactly what we're doing. We just got to trust the technology, and we're not there yet. But in my view of the perfect food systems, technology creates ultimate transparency, and that transparency benefits everybody in a lot of different ways. But we have a lot of existing systems that are going to have to break before we can go into that direction.
So now we can maybe turn the hat a little bit. You've got the multifaceted hat here, Danny, in the whole ag tech sphere. Okay, so it kind of falls into that problem of ag tech. A lot of companies are, not all of them, but a lot of them that pitch and that you've seen in the ag tech space have a technology looking for a problem, right? Versus what is the solution that's needed? What problems do we need to solve, right? And this whole transparency thing, um, what we're trying to solve there is we're trying to engage a consumer and provide them something they can trust. Okay, that's what's trying to be solved. So, even as transparency increases with technology, um, aren't we going to create an additional problem, as in, if you will, transparency overload? How do we sort through all of these things? And um, eh, talk about that a little bit. That whole dynamic of ag techs is a tech looking for a solution instead of a problem looking to be solved. And as we solve one problem, we kind of create others.
Well, I think one of the things I'll say to the tech looking for a problem is that there were ag tech companies that I've worked with that had good solutions to problems, but then they got funded by certain types of funding mechanisms that then turned into, hey, we need to find a problem that makes more money, even though we have a solution that solves a problem. Uh, and
Those greedy investors wanted higher returns on investment.
right, and they wanted them faster.
Yep.
Got to make that crop iterate more than once a year.
Yeah.
Uh, so, and then the transparency adds a layer of complexity to what we're doing, and this all goes to, in my mind, how the supply chains are built. Um, uh, and our supply chains, especially in specialty crops, in my mind, have been built around harvest optimization. And there's a lot of cost that goes into, sometimes 50% of the cost of growing something and getting it to a cooling shed is the harvest. So if I've got labor involved, I want to have as much as I can for that labor to do in one place at a time so I can optimize the use of the labor. Same concept could be said for a harvester, right? I want it to be able to just push through fruit. I don't want it to have to move to different fields. I want it to be able to just go. Well, what that's done is, to me, to understand when my crops are going to be ready and how to make that throughput go through my supply chain, or that post farm gate processing, especially on perishable products, the bigger the farm is, the better. Because now I have that much more control of what's happening. All of my resources and the logistics that go in, it's easier and it's more efficient. So it's not just that the farm itself is more efficient because now I can go have buying power for fertilizer, all of these things. It's also that I can go get better contracts, and a better contract doesn't necessarily mean price. It means timing. It means how much quantity they're going to come get. It means it's going to rain and they're going to send me an extra crew or an extra harvester so I can get more crop out, and they're going to carry more inventory for me. Those, as you get bigger, that's how the supply chain is designed to reward that right now. So as the farms have consolidated, and I'm speaking mostly, what I see on the West Coast, so too has food processing. And all of that consolidation, it's also happening at the sales level. And we're losing, in my mind, a lot of diversity. And I think that if there was more transparency and consumers understood that there's like really only 6 to 8 big players in each of these commodity groups, and they're yes, there's a lot of growers, but those growers are pretty beholden and they don't have a lot of choice. And, unless they get bigger, there's really no other way to play right now other than direct marketing, which is a whole nother challenge in itself. But uh, to me, right now, the supply chains are built to consolidate because it makes everything more efficient. And where I see technology and when I talk about transparency, creating opportunity is one, technology is going to make production cheaper. I do believe that the robots are coming and they're going to come fast and they're going to make a big difference in the next decade. So as we can see realization of harvest labor decreases and not just harvest labor in terms of the cost, but the availability. I have my own robots on my farm. I don't have to wait for a labor crew. I can run them 24/7. I think that opens the door up for a whole new level of services outside of farm labor contractors, which, I think seeing less of that and more robots in my mind is a good thing. I've worked with a lot of farm labor contractors, and you know, I don't know that it's something I want to sign my kids up for in terms of work to do. So, and I think that we're creating opportunity with robots, and I'm hitting this hard because in California we've kind of legislated that we don't want autonomy in our farms because we want to protect these jobs, and I don't see the what happened when we had the tomato harvester invention, losing 75, 85,000 jobs in 1 year. We're not going to have that. It's going to be a fast change, but it's not going to be that fast. So the technology and transparency right now, I think if people really understood and had a clear vision of how consolidated food is, I don't think they'd be as comfortable as they are. I think that there would be concerns with that. And then I think the technology though is opens the door both from a transparency standpoint to create marketing opportunity for smaller operations and smaller supply chains that want to develop. And it also creates lower production costs where they can compete. Um, I, I as consolidation happens, so does the cost of production, and that cost of production my entire career has just been higher, 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 and we got to put more into the crop to make profit, and it's not sustainable unless you've got private equity coming in and taking the bankrupt group that failed in the last 10 years and buying up that depreciated or that distressed asset, and they're going to go farm it for 10 years and it's probably going to end up in the same boat where another big group comes in and buys it, and it's just going to be a cyclical thing until maybe there's a bubble there, maybe there isn't, but I don't see how that's working entirely right now. But I do know that those large operations, they're more efficient because they're scaled and they can get better contracts, better pricing, better services. All of those things come with scale.
And so those 6 to 8 players, like you said, in most of the different commodities, is think about like our chemistry corporations. Same thing. We had 6 to 8 of them, and then boom, in 1 year's time, there was three. I mean, Dow DuPont went together, and Syngenta was acquired and put together at Chem China. Now we're down to Bayer Chem China, and Corteva. And that who would have thought that happened that quick, right? And you have that same risk of lack of diversity and competitiveness because essentially you're commoditizing everything. Everything is we're really poking for unique. Now, one little pushback on that, though, and I would love, we all have to answer this as farmers, is, I was visiting with a person who is the founder of Clarkson Grain, and Clarkson Grain here in central Illinois is a large organic procurement and shipper worldwide of organic grain crops. And, he says the customer doesn't want to be surprised when they eat food. The consumer wants the same thing all the time. And he says that is what is driving us to then. He says when we plant certain varieties of corn or wheat or soybeans or buckwheat, they want to have this many acres of this variety because then that means their mill turnout is this much incrementally better. And they know they consistently have that same end product that the customer consistently wants. So while we can rail about how this drives diversity out of our system. The buyer, the consumer at the end seems to be wanting this. So, do we just need to say, okay, be a little more adventurous, Mr. and Mrs. Smith here, or retrain your palate, or come on now, everything doesn't have to be McDonald's quarter pounders and fries, where it's the same thing, same experience at every location. Um, there's that pull through, even though maybe you and I don't like the diversity implications of it. The consumer is doing that. How does that change, Danny?
I I don't think that we've seen the change. I think there have been some instances or some things that have happened in the last decade that have slowed down the impact of consumer behavior from my generation. I'm an old millennial. But even more than that, like I still drink Coca-Cola, right?
Hmm.
My kids, there's all of these new things that are coming out and the marketing is entirely different. Like we look at Mr. Beast and what he's doing with chocolate and what he's talked about in the supply chain with chocolate. I think that we haven't seen the disruptions to the supply chain that marketing and things like YouTube are going to fully bring. I think Mr. Beast is just a small tidbit of what's to come. And I don't think that it's hit the food sector yet. It's hit other consumer brands or consumer sectors. It hasn't really hit the food sector yet. And that's kind of my anticipation too, is that consumer behavior, we don't understand. I don't understand. I have a 17-year-old and how she thinks and behaves is so different. Like I'm a degree different than my brother who's a generation ahead of me. But then man, you go 2 generations now and it's a completely different world, and they don't watch TV shows. They don't like how they behave is so different. And I think millennials' behaviors have been really in the last decade because of economic factors. We haven't been able to spend, I think, the way that we probably would have had other things not happened. And so I think we haven't seen the buying power of Gen Z come into play yet. I'm seeing it in my teenager and the things she wants to buy and the things she's asking for. And then I'm surrounded by a bunch of students now too. I have a half a dozen to a dozen students that are working for me that are all in their early 20s, and their behavior and how they consume and how they think is really different. Um, they're just like anybody else though. Cost absolutely matters. So in all these conversations, there's consumer behavior is still going to significantly, if not mostly, be driven by what the cost of production is or the cost to them is. And that's where the challenge and where the supply chain, I think, and technology being able to make smaller supply chains, smaller players in the supply chains more competitive is where the opportunity gets creative. And that's where marketing really comes into play. Um, I get asked on campus, I've been real lucky to have good hiring opportunities. And like I get a lot of good applicants, and people will ask, well, how are you doing? I just started an Instagram. And so I've asked everybody that I hire, like, how'd you find the farm? They're like, oh, we really like the Instagram. And it seemed like it'd be an interesting place. So where people are going to make those types of decisions is changing. And so I think that is going to create opportunities. And the other thing about where they're going, TikTok, Instagram, all those places, I can learn a lot about you. And we can start learning a lot about consumers through those medias. How does that media become accessible to the smaller players in the supply chain, and how do they leverage that technology or that insight to adjust what they're doing in their supply chain to be more competitive? And that's where I see us going. But we aren't there, and I also don't think we have the right skill set in the industry yet. We're still trying to figure out what we actually need, and it's hard to make commitments to hire people because it's expensive. Especially like in California is expensive. I'm sure it's expensive everywhere, but hiring a full-time employee, there's a lot that comes with that. And I think a lot of the transitions that operations need to make or businesses need to make require those new types of full-time employees that it's hard to make that commitment.
The AgEmerge podcast is brought to you by Ag Solutions Network. The ASN team is hands-on, digging in and invested in regenerative agriculture. Along with the proper plant nutrition and biologicals to boost your soil microbiome, we provide the ideas and implementation guidance to support you on your soil health journey. So stop farming the same way and contact Ag Solutions Network today at asn.farm.
Well, now I want you to tell us a little more about your most fun thing that you've done here with UC Merced. And you mentioned it there. It's been 20 years now. It's hard to imagine that's 20 years. Has it been that long? I remember I was checking tomato fields just right across from Bear Creek and could watch the construction. So I guess that means I'm getting up there, Danny. But
So 2005, I remember that because I think 2005 was when they had their first class, I think. So the first graduating class wasn't for a couple of years later, but I want to say 2005 is when like the doors opened.
wow, yeah, I remember checking tomato fields up there in '07.
Hmm.
So anyway, we're getting old, Eddie. But I mean there's a unique um, is this a generational appropriate word as unique vibe associated with UC Merced because it is young. It don't have that, you know, ingrained. This is kind of what we've done. They've brought in a lot of new people that, are the first generation tenure people,
Hmm.
professors there, and I've enjoyed working with the various ag technology expos and showcases there and groups on. Um, I've done some working with Stefano and
Hmm.
those groups there in the engineering, and it's a lot of fun. The attitude there, and so you got to give us a deep dive in what all you got cooking there, and how it came to be, and what some of the exciting things you got on the growing season schedule this year.
So I'm going to lead with I think the thing that we have most uniquely right now in food and ag is that we are uninfluenced. We are so brand new and so fresh into the ag space that we don't have any influences. We are a completely blank slate, and we get to have the opportunity to filter our influences if I'm, right
Oh,
now. So
so you don't have the campus technology park where all of the big OEMs, all the chem companies, all the seed companies have an office station right there that is their unofficial lobbying department for the university.
I don't even have a building. So,
Perfect.
office sounds great just for me. uh, no, so the story of ag at UC Merced is one of kind of grit from a couple of faculty who were doing research on the fringes of ag and doing research that was impactful on ag. Professor Josh Veers, professor of civil engineering, was doing different types of work around water. And then Professor Thomas Harmon from the Sierra Nevada Research Institute was doing a lot of different research around groundwater and how what's happening in the Sierras and our wonderful snowpack affects what could potentially happen with recharge and a lot of different things with water resources. At the same time, we had some other faculty who were starting to do through capstone projects, um, fringe work of ag tech and in food processing as well in term on the mechanical engineering side. So those combinations, along with a chancellor who is really excited about the opportunity that being in ag is in the middle of an ag area, um, you know, it created the perfect ecosystem in terms of leadership and faculty to drive home the idea that UC Merced can have a farm. And so that was happening pre-COVID. And then our now congressperson at that point was a state assemblyman or state senator, Adam Gray, got our first $5 million in startup funding. So Chancellor found some space and these professors found some space, found some funding. The next piece to that puzzle was finding a person to kind of put all the pieces together. And that's where the stars aligned. And I was able to fill that void in terms of a person. And then really what kind of solidified everything was that to make everything continue to move forward was in the November of 2022. Um, President Drake announced, the president of the UC announced both UC Merced and UC Santa Cruz as ag experimental stations. And what that does is opens us up to some of the federal funding for AES. And there's Hatch Act. There's a couple of other long-standing acts that financially support ag research across the country. So California gets over $100 million of AES funding on an annual basis, and UC Merced's getting like 1% of that. But for us right now, that largely that'll go to start supporting our first faculty. But there's also some operating funding that comes with that. So what we've been able to do so far is build out. We had 40 acres. I'd say about 30 acres of farmable. It was all irrigated pasture to start, and we're going to end up with about 28 acres of farmable land. And we have 16 1-acre plots, and then a bunch of smaller plots. We've primarily been growing forage. We're going into this year. We'll finally have our first full year with an irrigation system. We have a reservoir with a VFD. We have 40 automated valves that we'll be able to control autonomously, do the whole real-time irrigation. If you have a sensor out there, it can turn things on and off. So we're equipped to do a lot of cool stuff. All of the 1-acre plots have both a 2-inch automated valve, and then there's a 6-inch valve. So if we want to flood or do sprinklers or do any type of irrigation you want to hook up, you can. Going into this spring, I'll just talk about we've got forage that we'll harvest the end of April. We'll get that baled up and we'll start planting waiule. And then we've got a garden plot for some agrivoltaics research that we're putting in. So we'll do kale, tomatoes, and melons. We're going to be putting in a pumpkin patch that our Ag Tech Club will be kind of getting to manage, and then maybe do a corn maze, some sweet corn, stuff like that. So we've got that going, both so we have some outreach and community engagement stuff, and then we have research. The kind of coolest research that I think I have going on right now, and it's just because it's very recent for me. Professor Harmon has 2 acres that we've dedicated to putting some recharge basins on, and it's not doing deep aquifer recharge. It's looking at shallow aquifer recharge. And there's been a lot of different technology that has gone into figuring out which spots of our farm would be the best place to do this. And I'm sure there will be publications about all the different pieces, but started with, I think it's an item sled that goes down pretty deep and does some scans to find different types of potential soil types. And then we did soil boring. And then from the boring and those profiles, we found some spots where I think we have some gravel and sand pockets about 30 to 50 feet deep. So we're going to flood these spaces about 2 feet of water, and we can monitor how much water is ending up in those pockets. I'm excited about that just because I think it's potentially impactful. And it's stuff that, we're building the reservoirs and kind of doing it ourselves, which is another, for me is a big thing for us. It gets real expensive to do anything in California. So as much as we can do on our farm, we're doing with myself and students. So we can kind of significantly reduce the cost of research when it's our tractor, our GPS, our RTK, and then me and students, and students are getting to learn a skill it's very much applicable, even if they're in civil engineering, it's a skill they're learning. So that's a kind of rough where we're at. I can dive into any of the things that we've got going on. We're getting ready to plant some almonds this fall, and that's exciting. We should have some good announcements coming out in the next month about that project. So it's a pretty blank slate right now, and like I said, it's uninfluenced. So we're looking for the right industry partners that we can find to partner with the right researchers that are doing that research on the fringe of ag, and ideally we can find industry research that can go right alongside or in parallel with some of this other research that we have going on.
Well, first off, I like the community dynamic of keeping people involved with, the pumpkin patch, corn maze, and such. It keeps people wondering what's going, because you got to have students coming in to keep the program going. So that's a great interactive opportunity there. Um, the shallow groundwater, that's a great idea because when you think about it, historically, when we came there, everything was irrigated in the Central Valley and in the old days on shallow water, right? Until we depleted it. But there's still places to store that where we can take, flood flows and do temporary storage into those and then re-access it later without tapping into the deep groundwater, or below Corcoran clay and other areas type of scenarios. So we can get good quality water stored shallow and not build these 40 and 50 acre ponds, right, that are subject to huge amounts of surface evaporation and a lot of ground put out of productivity. So that's going to be interesting to see where that goes. Hey, do you have any idea of how big of an area you've identified as far as acre foot holding capacity?
So we've got two quarter to a third acre reservoirs built, and we're gonna actually Friday I'm gonna start filling them this week, and then we're
Right.
probably gonna have to do some more elevation gains. Got to do some more cutting and get it so we can get 2 feet all the way across with no issues. And then yeah, it's a multi-year project, so we're rushing right now so that way we can start collecting data this year,
So
at
the
least
goal is
this
those
winter.
surface reservoirs then will act as the leaching site to the shallow groundwater, and you'll be able to monitor, evaporative losses versus, overall, you know, supply and go to get what went in there, and then hopefully you can monitor what you pump out of the shallow groundwater. Is that what you're thinking there?
Yeah, and it's to mimic too the idea of there's times where we have runoff that let's capture that runoff during flood flows and peak times and have places to put it. And like you said, there's these huge projects for these large, deep
Yeah.
aquifer recharge, but especially along the foothills of the Sierra Nevadas here in the Central Valley, there's a lot of gravel that's not super deep,
Right.
and that's porosity where we can push some water. So
Yeah.
we aren't at a phase where we're going to pull anything out yet. I think we're going to see just because permitting gets different.
Okay.
So right now we're just putting water in, and we're going to measure how much water comes in, and if that's successful, we'll work on the next phase of like, all right, let's go jump through the hoops, check the boxes, so we can pull some water out.
You know,
But that's the next exercise. Right now, we're just gonna see how much we can get down there.
and probably with some various electromagnetic tools, you can get a good estimation of how much water went there and where it laterally moved to.
And that's where it's fun for me. I'm a conceptual systems thinker, but I'm surrounded by people who get into the details and have the expertise on how to quantify and measure some of these more specific things that I cover too many spaces to get into the details about. But I'm surrounded by people now who this is what they do. They're experts in what they do, and then
Awesome.
I get to also balance that and guide them into like this is kind of how it works out there in the world.
Right. Right. You need the practical application. Agrivoltaics, you mentioned that. That is so exciting because in California, especially, there's high value to renewable energy generation. But there's another little wonderful part to agrivoltaics, especially with grapevines or permanent crops. Makes the infrastructure of those a little more appealing. But the shade portion that they offer, there's quite a bit of good research out of Europe on if you have like a 50% shading pattern created by agrivoltaics, your yield is impacted minimally, but your water use efficiency almost doubles. Walk us through some of the thing that you and your team are looking at there with agrivoltaics and combining with water use or other opportunities within that.
So one of the fun
Hold on, I'm
things.
sorry.
Oh,
Let's stop. What is agrovoltaics?
so and is it agro or agri, right?
Agra, sorry.
Agrivoltaics, farming underneath solar panels,
Very
and designing the your system such that we're going to be able to fit our 6R set up on 80-inch wheelbase. It's going to be able to fit through there, and we've got different spacings. So that's one of the things we're looking at is how do you design a system? How does that work with irrigation and row spacing? So what's fun for this project specifically, though, is that the primary investigator or the PI in this case is not, I mean, nothing with farming in their career. They are a solar researcher. So it's been real fun to have that completely new perspective and having their ideas where they aren't blinded by the barriers that I see and the challenges that I see. So they can throw ideas out there. And I'm immediately sometimes like, whoa, whoa, whoa. But then when they give me their thoughts, it's like, okay, I see why this is important from your system. Why do I really need this in my system? Is my system really this fixed, or can I tweak and adapt what I'm doing easier to get the benefit that they're looking for? So right now we're just going through our RFP process with different vendors who are coming out and doing the bids on the trackers. We've got our panels, they're sitting at the farm, just got to do the tracking and get the trackers in. So crops we're going to grow. We're going to grow tomatoes, kale, and melons only because I know how to grow tomatoes and melons. And then kale is just I something that the researcher we kind of all right, let's try it. So I think there might be a couple other things that we throw in there this year. Um, but where we've really run into the most conversations is irrigation type, which way the rows should go, and then measuring the tractor and figuring out how the design needs to really fit, whether the panels are vertical or horizontal and what angles they need to be at for us to fit our, 10-foot tall, 11-foot tall tractor that's, 100 inches wide at the axles through.
But back to your robots, you get the robots that eliminates all those cabs and stuff like that. So yeah. Anyway,
I'm all for that. I just don't have one of those yet, so I'm probably a few years from it. So I got to be able to do something now.
are you on the wait list for a Tesla humanoid or something from
Oh,
MIT or something at the moment?
no, I should be though.
You should. You really should.
It's semi-autonomous though. It's not fully autonomous.
Oh, okay. Okay. So the other thing that you mentioned, I definitely know you're excited about is it sounds like we got some Wisecon partnership there with sensors and an automated watering. So today we have moisture sensors on a low density, and sometimes some farmers trust them. Most of the time they don't, and the consultants don't either, because then they would be fired and couldn't go out and sample soil with their fingers. But anyway, and then once they do get that information, it's extraordinarily hard for them to irrigate because it's something set up in 10, 20, or 40 acre, 80 acre blocks at a time. So, the ability to high density acquire information and high density apply a result is different. So it sounds like you're taking people out of this. You're using computer modeling to indicate what is the best for the soil and the plant at this time and allow it to irrigate accordingly. Am I kind of hearing things right?
Yeah, I think there's a little bit more to it. And when I first worked, the first farm I was out of college, we were farming about 15,000 acres processing tomatoes, and we had a aerometer in every field. And somebody went out and once a week was checking moisture. So the idea that it can't be done at scale and that it's not important and that farmers like no, but the only reason those sensors were there was to make sure we didn't screw up. They are quality control, not quality assurance, quality control. They're checking on the backside, and it's our CYA to make sure that hey, everything we needed is there. And then when there's an anomaly, I know I need to go check something out. Is it the sensor or is there something wrong in the field? Half the time it was the sensor, which is probably why there's a lack of trust in the sensors.
Right.
But if you have an array of sensors out there and one starts behaving abnormally, we have these really cool AI technologies now that can call that out pretty quickly and give you an alert. And then you can determine without sending a person out there whether or not it's actually an issue with the field or an issue with the sensor. The challenge is the cost of those sensors versus the cost of the person going out and doing it. And I think we're finally getting to the point where the cost of the sensor is now at a point where it's cheaper, at least in California, than sending the person. The other thing that I'll say to the irrigation is early on in my career too, it was not about we irrigated on a weekly basis. Depending on which ranch we were on, I had to call for water 72 hours in advance. I had no reservoirs. I had wells that had a specific flow. So my irrigation management was much more about the logistics of moving water to where I could for a period of time and then going to the next block because I didn't have any storage capacity, and that's fairly common. So, one of the other things and I actually had a group from Ukraine out at the farm 2 weeks ago. And they have a whole irrigation referendum going on right now, amongst other things. But they were really interested in the reservoir that we built. And I explained my entire career, irrigation automation and doing real time irrigation has been constrained by not having reservoirs or having the capacity to flip the pump on when I need the water. You either have water or you don't. And when you have it, you got to have a plan for where you're moving it to. And that was irrigation management. You took your ET. I know this block needs this many hours this week. I know all these other blocks need this many hours. How do I move water around to get it to all those places and maximize the hours? And then, oh, by the way, power is really expensive from 4 to 8 p.m., so you got to shut off.
Yeah.
So it becomes much more of a logistics constraint than this is when the crop needs the water. And then now with all of our drip systems, we've thrown fertigation into the mix. And when you're irrigating a row crop environment, if I need to irrigate tomatoes and cotton at the same time on the same drip system and they have two different fertilizer regimens, oh man, and I've centralized all my fertilizer at my drip system. I've created a lot of efficiency, but I've also created some more constraints. So irrigation management for me, my dream has always been to have fertigation after the valve. So having tanks after the valve at the valve set,
Hmm.
so I can fertigate after and not have to mix with other crops. I
Yeah.
have that. I have a VFD. I can turn water on when I need water. So yeah, now the idea of having a soil moisture sensor or an array of sensors and an algorithm that says when these sensors all hit these characteristics, we want to turn the water on, and then when they all hit this characteristic, we want to turn it off. Um, that's I had that we have that now, and but there's so many constraints in the logistics of that realization takes infrastructure and that costs money, and
Yeah.
you know that's bottom line. It takes money to do these things, and so that's where you spend a lot of time in Excel and seeing does it pencil out for us to put all of this in right now. Are we going to go the next 2 years with irrigators because yeah, it's tight, but man, I can make that work. The capital investment I have to make with financing and interest where it's at, I can't make that work right now.
Hmm.
Um, and I think that's where a lot of folks that are smaller and don't have, money coming from outside sources and private equity to make those improvements. Yeah, irrigation gets real fun, real fast.
Yeah, and I like your idea of the injection downstream from the valve. That just requires another set of lines, essentially from a centralized system all the way down to those individual valves.
Or what
No,
we
it can work.
what I've done is I've got 240 gallon totes that I can sit right there. I have 1 acre plots. That's a whole season of fertilizer, if not
Sure.
more. So and then I've got little 5 horsepower, 2.5 horsepower pumps, electric pumps that have a generator that I can plop right on top of those totes, and I could actually connect that stuff up to a cell system if I wanted to. Right now, we're going to be out there doing things anyway, so we'll do it by hand. But
Right.
um, it gives you a lot of flexibility with fertigation. And then when we look at biologics or teas and things like that, I like the idea of putting it right where it needs to be versus sending it through my whole system.
Yeah. Yeah, and but scaling that is relatively feasible. You know.
It's different, but it's I don't look at it too different than having a nurse system for sprayers. I'm gonna have to go fill these tanks, and then I'm still gonna have a person out there. Now they're firing a generator up to run the fertilizer, or if you have electricity at your, I think that's another whole thing, microgrids, and I have a like how we can create different types of pumping systems to do this type of stuff with solar and batteries.
So
So
you're putting a
there's
whole new meaning to the word a sandbox here, Danny.
it, it's a sandbox, and then but feasibility does it really work?
Yeah.
And but I'm yes, we're 1 acre plots, but I'm fairly confident that a lot of the solutions we can generate for a 1 acre plot, the infrastructure for our plots are no different than a 100 acre plot. you
Right.
know,
But that, the purpose of that 1 acre is to try new ideas that haven't been done before, to be able to closely monitor results and identify things that I then can move on to a larger scalable solution, for an intermittent phase before it becomes. But if nobody's doing the 1 acre, how's it going to get started? If no one's asking these questions, we're not going to get the answers. So kudos to you and your team that you're putting together there to make these things happen. So now we do all these wonderful things. How do we, I guess, kind of the ultimate question is how do we make regenerative agriculture the conventional agriculture?
make it profitable for smaller growers. And that requires a supply chain that supports the smaller grower. Um, but
You
the
do you
game has
believe this
been,
the smaller grower is a requirement?
I believe that, and as much as I love technology and believe that I could go manage a lot of acres really, really well using technology, the only way I'm managing it well is if I'm present. I still have to be out there. I have to be aware of the operations. I have to be in touch with the land. I think that's real. I think there's an art to farming. And the artists of the future are going to be the ones who can take that technology and leverage it to create their artwork, which is whatever they're producing. Um, but right now, the only way, the way to compete and the mindset to compete is I got to grow, I got to grow, I got to grow so I can be bigger, bigger, bigger. I got to spend more to make more. And that it doesn't work anymore. And the, you know, banking,
That's a terminal diagnosis, isn't it?
I don't see as much as I want to see other ways around it. You, there's got to be a place, there's got to be places post farm gate that support the smaller farmer that still feed the larger supply chain. And that's just not how things are designed right now. So I think regenerative creates the opportunity for an operation to say, hey, I've been spending $4,000 an acre on my crops every year. I'm paying this much in interest on my operating loans. I'm doing all of these things. I want to turn the dial the other way. We've been turning the dial the same direction for, I've been involved for about 20 years now. It's been the same, more, more, more. Find another thing to put in but we can't take anything out. I think regenerative creates the opportunity, and without having a bunch of marketing behind it, for growers just to simply say there's a way to turn the dial down. But that, like, if I'm a tomato grower and I'm going to spray a little less herbicide, that means I'm going to have a dirtier crop. That means more MOT. There's a real cost to that. So now not only am I getting less yield, I'm getting paid less, and that's not what the supply chain is designed for. Now, if I got paid purely for solids, and it wasn't about, now that changes the dynamic a little bit. As a tomato grower, I'm not worried about pumping that last 10, 15 tons in the last month of the crop using my fantastic subsurface drip irrigation system.
Yeah.
Now I'm looking at, I just want the solids.
Hmm.
So, there's things that we can move towards, but really regenerative for me is it's looking at it. Nothing's absolute, but we can start giving opportunities to put less in. I think that how a grower does that is going to be on their own. You know, they get the freedom to make those decisions, but there's hopefully more and more growers that are going to provide the example, and hopefully we can, UC Merced, provide some examples of how we can turn the dial back. Some of these very standard practices that cost a lot of money. What happens if we don't do it that way?
Hmm.
Um, and that's what I'm excited is some of the what happens if, and being able to not have my livelihood put in jeopardy. And that's, a lot of people face that. What happens if it goes wrong, my livelihood is in jeopardy. I'm probably going to take a more conservative what happens if that's my situation.
Hmm. There's a lot of institutional capital coming into farming, especially in California, and um, that's just perpetuating our current production system. But I do think that's finite now. And there is something to definitely be said about there's going to need to be more eyeballs or more ownership eyeballs per acre, and you're going to need to train up a huge herd of future farmers here to really fulfill that opportunity to
Here's a
provide what
here's a
people want.
here's a really progressive thought. Some of these big institutions haven't done so well, and some of their assets, have become assets that are, I don't call them fire sale, but we'll call it a fire sale. I am not opposed, like what, and this again is a very progressive thought, and it's not necessarily how I think in general, but why isn't there an institution that's coming in and creating a cooperative out of one of these really large assets and creating an opportunity for a new generation of farm managers to come in? Pacific AgRentals has showed us that shared equipment can work if it's managed well. So, the next time there's a 10, 20,000 acre asset that's going bankrupt, or why doesn't, and what institution it is, but I think there's some really creative opportunities for public-private partnerships to purchase something like that, create a cooperative on the water rights, create a cooperative on equipment, create a cooperative on the supply chain, so vertically integrate that cooperative. And we've done this in the past, but transparency killed that. This person's getting a little bit more in the pool. This person's getting, all those financial transactions that end up at, the board level where there's very few eyes on it. That all goes away with transparency and technology that we can implement in the supply chain. So the idea of more collective or collaborative, or even call them cooperatives, in specialty crops, especially where there's a real need for that vertical integration. And I know it's the same in commodities, but I'm I would love to see, and that's actually, I would be really curious to see some sort of public-private partnership that is creating that diversity opportunity for, I'm too old now. I've got kids and families, so the idea that I can go pound the pavement on a farm for, my from 25 to 35, which is the years where you really got to do it. I'm past that, but I'd love to be a part of an opportunity for a next generation that's coming through that doesn't have a family farm to go to, that but man, they want to farm and they've got that hunger. And I know there's a ton of guys in the industry that would chomp at the bit for something like that. That people are out there and they're knowledgeable and they're experienced and they're selling things right now. Well, let's have them stop selling fertilizer and let's have them go run a farm based on the knowledge and experience they picked up in the last however many years in the industry. So I think there's some creative opportunities. But again, that's a really progressive thought, but I get really frustrated when I see, these large assets just go into another big group that in 10 years is going to sell it to another fund. And they're involved in capital that doesn't really have anything to do with the performance of the asset. The asset just needs to maintain its value. But at the same time, that large asset has a huge impact on the competitive nature around the inputs and the processing of that crop. So it creates a competitive environment that small farmers can't compete in.
I don't think farmer cooperatives are too progressive of thought. We did those 150 years ago and on, right? To be
Well,
able to do something that couldn't be done individually, right? And
and
wasn't being provided by by independent or private ownership. So
and
have a great fit.
my understanding is a lot of those cooperatives failed because of lack of transparency in financial transactions.
Or
So
they
if we
started well and went off the rails, right?
yeah, power and control, so that
Yep,
if we can have transparency from the get-go, especially on sales and pooling and those types of things, people can work together pretty darn well.
absolutely. Yeah. Well, what other wild thoughts you got going through your head these days, Danny? Where I don't want to keep you from the skis, but I just want anything else we should have visited about while we had some time together here today.
Uh, I think that we have yet to see what we're going to see in the next 5 and 10 years. I think from the things on the fringes of ag that are really interesting right now, I think the new egg nuclear, your little micronuclear power plant at home, when we start thinking about some of the challenges with sensing and farms. So battery technology and power technology, I think, are really important to pay attention to. And then I think the other thing that I'm curious about right now is water and biologics, and kind of you hit a little bit on shade. Do we really understand how much water we need? Like ET is telling us how much water we need. So I think there's opportunities for us to continue to use less water, even though California, hats off to every farmer in California, because there's a lot of data that suggests that the last 20 years we've gotten really good with our water. We've gotten more and more efficient. So us acknowledging that there's still room for improvement shouldn't shy away or take away from the fact of how great of a job farmers in California have done. So great that in some areas we're figuring out that maybe, drip isn't the best solution because there's other geological factors or hydrological factors at play where we do want to flood the ground. But I think we've just started scratching the surface on water and understanding how to apply water. So power and water will continue to be, for me, the two places I'm really paying attention. I just those are the two things that I'm curious about.
Well, what's the best way for folks to connect with you and see what you're doing there at the UC Merced farm and those kind of things? You mentioned this Instagram account.
Yeah, so I have my Instagram, but I'm more of a dad than I am a social media person anymore. So I have Ag Tech Leader as my handle, and occasionally I post something. But really, it's let me make sure I get this right real quick.
And we could put a
So
link in the notes too.
yeah, it's so my students run. It's the ESF, and I just want to make sure I get it right here. Uh, and it's great. It's ESF underscore UCM, and that's on Instagram. Uh, it's funny, it's lighthearted, but it's also kind of insightful into the like different types of things that we're getting ourselves into. And there's always something on a different research project or different student engagement. So that would be where I would guide people to in terms of keeping in touch with what's going on.
That is awesome. Personally, I'd like to thank you for all the work you've done of bringing ag technology together into regenerative agriculture principles and practices. Really, firing up the next generation that's going to take over and make this happen. It's great to see the work that you've put into this and how you've brought all of your experiences together to make this happen. So thank you, Danny, for all that you're doing in this regard.
In all seriousness, Monty, the things that I do aren't possible without industry folks like you and the things you're doing with this podcast. You're a real leader in the space, and I was really excited to spend time with you today and appreciate being able to just chat a little bit.
Well, it's great. I'll be back out in a couple of weeks, so maybe I'll get a chance to see you then.
Keep in touch.
All right, take care, Danny.
What a great story. Danny's hands on journey has redefined how we grow food sustainably. And as a family man and community leader, he's crafting a balanced future for his 3 kids and beyond. It's exciting to see how he's actively changing the face of agriculture. And hey, be sure to subscribe to the AgEmerge podcast to hear from more of our guests who are constantly improving their operations and innovating the way they farm. And if you'd like to learn more about what we're doing to help growers innovate, check out our website at asn.farm. And there you can click on links to follow us on Facebook, X, Instagram, LinkedIn, and YouTube. There's a lot of great things happening and always something to learn. Thanks for listening.